we're on such a punctilious schedule that I'm waiting for somebody to put his arm up. And I'm not sure who, don't anybody raise their hands. But at some point, the arm is up. Now I can start. For those of you who did not see the slides, which I guess just came on because they were registering, I'd now like to introduce myself. My name is Richard Benedict. I have the honor to be the president of this unique organization, the National Council for Science and the Environment. And I wanted also to say that there will be, after this is now more formal welcoming to our conference that I'm doing now, and after this we'll go into the agenda, which you can see in the program. I actually was quite personally both moved and brought back some very pleasant memories of this with this slideshow, particularly the reference to the former Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, because at that time I was in the State Department and responsible for international environmental affairs and policies and negotiations. And I had the great privilege to be the chief U.S. negotiator for the Montreal Ozone Protocol on protection of the stratospheric ozone layer. And Secretary of Interior James Watt and some of his colleagues thought, when we started to plan for these negotiations, that we would never get a strong treaty because the odds were against us. Many of the big, here they mentioned the big oil companies. In those cases, it was the big chemical companies, with the great exception of DuPont, which was the largest producer and which had a very enlightened leader. His name was Ed Woolard, and chair of the board. And we had very heavy odds against us when we started because all of the major producing countries, Russia, Japan, and even Europe, in those days the European community, with the exception of Germany, which I had a lot of personal relations. I just got back, as I mentioned earlier, from Berlin. I had an office in Berlin, and I had served with our embassy in Bonn way in my early days as a foreign service officer. But that, I had a lot of good contacts, and I knew that the German government within the EC was was more inclined for a strong treaty. But the EC had to negotiate as a unit. And we did all kinds of interesting things, but this was all in the background. We had relations with the Soviets, that was in the days of the Cold War, I remind you, which I called in the book that I wrote about it, ozone glasnost, that we were actually working with the Soviets behind the scenes because the European Union was posing themselves as being in the middle with the US and Canada and our usually reliable Nordic colleagues. We were the radicals. We wanted a strong treaty. And the other side, Russia and Japan, which were major producers, Soviet Union and Japan, were very strongly against the treaty. And the EU wanted a weak treaty, and they thought that they could slide in between us. And what they didn't know was that we were doing this kind of secret diplomacy that nobody knew about until the very end, that we had this collaboration between the ozone glasnost was because we had our NASA actually collaborating with the Soviet Space Agency on measurements of the ozone layer and other critical scientific activities. And we did the same with the Japanese, and nobody knew about that. Anyway, what happened in the course of a year of negotiations was that people could see that we were gradually, in the beginning it was a little bit tricky because I had to be very careful not to reveal too much, and I actually was brought before the Congress because some of them were saying that I was being too coy, that I wasn't forcefully advancing our position, and others thought that I was selling the store, giving away much too much. So, and others thought that I was being too strong. That's the kind of thing that a diplomat has to face every day. And probably all of you have to be diplomats in your own households and your own work, so it's not unfamiliar. In any event, Watt tried to get me fired and to change the U.S. position rather late in the game. And the decision went up to the President Reagan. And he was not famous as an environmental president, but he had a lot of common sense, and somehow he came up with the right ideas. And But the one thing was that I was not allowed to say that I got a secret message from the president while I was actually coincidentally in Berlin. And I was giving an address on the 40th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, but not on the ozone layer. And this young diplomat came in, it was in June, and he was all perspiring. He said, because we didn't have an embassy in Berlin. This was when our embassy was in Bonn, and the only embassy in Berlin was on the east, was in East Berlin. And he came across the border to the Reichstag, where I was giving a speech at this conference like this. And, but it wasn't on ozone, as I say, it was on other issues. And there was a reception, he came up and he was all sweating, and he said, "Are you Ambassador Benedict?" I said, somebody pointed me out. I said, "Yes." He said, "I have a message for you. And it's directly from the White House, and only you are allowed to read it, and we've never had in our embassy in Berlin such a secret message, because it comes out of the coding machine, goes automatically into an envelope, nobody sees it. He brings this sealed envelope to me. I am supposed to read it in his presence, and then burn it in his presence." I said, "At least it's not burned before reading." And that was the president's instructions. And he had come down the line at each point where it was us on one side and Secretary Rod and his friends on the other side. And each one of them was checked off by the president on what we wanted, a strong treaty, which was the final negotiation 3 months from then, this was June and September, in Montreal. And I went through that. And the one thing was that I could not reveal that the president had made this decision. And so when I went off to the other negotiations, the EU was still thinking, they were still whispering, "Don't worry about Benedict, he's going to be fired soon, and the US is going to weaken its position." And they were wrong. Now, one of the things about the Montreal Protocol, in the 1 minute that I now have remaining, is that it showed that nature does not give convenient early warning signals before there is a collapse. Now, you all have heard about the Antarctic ozone hole. Well, chlorine concentrations in the stratosphere, which kills the ozone layer, which protects us all from harmful radiation. Chlorine, the natural form, is 0.6 parts per billion. That's nature, very small. It began to slowly rise because of man-made products from 0.6 to 1.2, doubling, nothing happening. It continued to rise to 1.8 parts per billion, triple the natural consistency. Nothing happened. But when it hit 2 parts per billion, there was a sudden, totally unexpected collapse, which shows that nature does not give us convenient early warning signals. And if we are to err, it's better that we err on the side of caution when we're dealing with this planet of ours. Now we're beginning our 3-day program with a very remarkable keynote interview by Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar of both co-chairs of the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. The Honorable William Reilly, former EPA administrator, is an old friend of mine. When I was deputized by the Secretary of State to be a diplomat in residence and a senior fellow at the World Wildlife Fund when he was president of that remarkable organization. So there will be William Reilly and Senator Bob Graham, both co-chairs of this important new commission. They will be introduced by the Honorable Kenneth Salazar. And by the way, I'm also instructed to ask you all to get these blank cards, and if you have questions following this interview and the discussion, please raise your card, and like magic, someone will appear and will collect them, and you can have questions with you. We're also very, very pleased that the interview of these two unique gentlemen will be conducted by Ray Suarez, whom all of you have known from National Public Radio and Television, Public Broadcasting System. So I'm very happy now to start with the first formal part of our 3-day conference, and thank you for your patience.
Well, gentlemen, good to see you both. Senator, the words that jump out from the executive summary when your committee delivered its conclusions, commission delivered its conclusions, was that the Macondo well tragedy was foreseeable and preventable. In some ways, those words are so heavy, so indicting, that you almost don't need to go on, but then it's laid out for the next 50 pages in chapter and verse and makes pretty bracing reading. But let's start with those two words, foreseeable and preventable. How?
Well, it was foreseeable because there had been an evolution of the offshore oil drilling industry into deeper and deeper waters. There was virtually no deep water drilling done in the United States as recently as 1990. Today, more than half of the oil that's lifted in the Gulf comes from areas that are more than 1,000 feet below the surface of the water. As we move into deeper areas, there is inherently greater risk. There was a tremendous development of the technology in order to do that. As we learned from the Macondo, there is probably a close parallel between space exploration and exploration of the deep ocean in terms of technical sophistication and in complexity. What didn't happen and what made this foreseen was that there was not a commensurate improvement in safety, containment, or ability to respond to an untoward event. Preventable on the specific instances that occurred on that rig within the hours before the explosion. There were at least 9 events in which people either ignored warning signals, failed to see warning signals, overrode warning signals, which cascaded into the circumstance that led to gas in the pipe, a kick, as the industry calls it, and the eventual explosion. So we concluded that this was a foreseen event, a preventable event, and thus even the greater tragedy.
Well, Mr. Reilly, in the chronology that the commission put together, all these series of events where if someone had put the brakes on early, a lot of heartache could have been avoided, taken as a whole, show a kind of, well, we'll let the other guys worry about it, sort of mentality. Why? Were cost considerations involved? Were the 3 big corporate players identified in the report trying to do this quickly and cheaply as much as anything else?
Well, I think the decisions that we cite in the report, in one very illuminating and disturbing graph, relate a set of decisions and ask the question, was there an alternative, a safer alternative, and would it have taken more time? And the answer to the latter question in almost all cases is yes, it would have taken more time to be more careful, to conduct more tests, to obtain more centralizers, and a whole range of things to be certain about the cementing, which failed. This bespeaks, I think, a sense of complacency in the industry. And I am now very aware, because I've heard directly from oil company executives and some major CEOs, about the degree to which that is offensive to several company leaders. They do not consider their companies are complacent, that quite a number of companies have sterling environmental and safety records. And we did not mean by saying that there is a systemic problem in the industry or that there's a sense of complacency to in any way derogate